you're a politician. You're running for mayor.
Sure.
You can't use your political office for slamming a business. I mean, you might get attacked by a lot of people. Are you just going to turn on them if they attack you?
I mean, I'll just say it this way. The city makes deals with all kinds of companies. We get to be strategic about not only what we invest in, who we invest in, what kinds of people we'd like to attract to this city.
So, Freddie, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having
So
me.
glad you're here. Nashville native. I want to kind of
Yeah.
ask you some broad questions, and then
Sure.
we'll get a little more detailed.
Yeah.
So, where did you grow up, and what's your background here?
Yeah, grew up in Richland West End, kind of West Nashville, before there was an I-440, and the house my parents are still in. And they got into the neighborhood when it was still surprisingly cheap to get into in the 1970s. Got a younger brother, and it was a classic story of childhood and a family kind of trying to, do whatever was possible to move from working class to middle class. My mom was a career teacher. My dad had studied agricultural sciences in college and came back here and worked for USDA for a lot of his career. And we were probably the only family in Richland West End when we were growing up to have a cattle chute in the driveway, because he was trying to eradicate brucellosis from cattle herds across Tennessee.
Interesting.
So I got to experience rural Middle Tennessee as a kid, which was very interesting. And we would ride our bikes. We had a bunch of kids in the neighborhood, and it was kind of like, tumble out the back door, go find the neighborhood kids, and generally stay in the neighborhood. And the edge of the neighborhood was this the railroad track. We'd go explore with our friends, kind of up and down that for a mile in every direction. And then grew up interested in computers and knew I wanted to go study computer science. So when I left Nashville for college, that's exactly what I did, and lucked into some really good internships throughout high school and college, learning how to do that stuff in an applied way, and have had a 20-plus year career in software and technology. So it's been an interesting journey. And then, it's interesting because I didn't think, I definitely knew that I wanted to go to college. I knew what I wanted to study, and I knew that I wanted to spend some time outside of Nashville. And so kind of made a deal with my parents that I would work my way through summers and winters, kick that into tuition, pick up any student debt on the backside myself, but that I could, they'd help with tuition. I'd have whatever school I could get into, we'd work that out. And I knew I wanted to have a different experience than Nashville for a part of life where I knew it was going to be away, but then would have open options. And I wasn't sure when I left. I honestly thought I might not be coming back to Nashville. But, it's interesting because you learn a lot by being gone. You learn a lot by experiencing other cities, what a city's potential is, and also that great cities don't happen by accident.
Mm-hmm.
And so by the time I got back, I was seeing signs of what then Mayor Bredesen, had done to kind of start to modernize downtown and to even allow people to start living downtown. And Nashville was starting to, it was almost like we had made a choice right in that moment that I was away of, oh yeah, hey, we'd like to try being a big city. Mm-hmm. And now what I think we found, 20 plus years later, is that was great, but also it still matters. And so when you go through 3 mayors in 3 years and growth is kind of managing you rather than vice versa, you get to a place that's a little uncomfortable. And so I spent a long time doing things that I cared a lot about, because in that period of getting back, I wound up basically making a tough decision where I had just paid off all my undergraduate debt. And that was the moment that the car I was driving, which was my girlfriend's car, she was away doing pre-med. It had a catastrophic transmission failure. So what a great reward for becoming debt-free is this incredible choice of, do I buy a car or do I save up for a house? And I bought a bike instead. And so I figured out how to move around the city without a car and figured out our transit system. And then in those years, it was amazing how quickly I saved money. And that became a down payment for the house we've been in for 16 years in Salem Town. So I moved from kind of West Nashville to inner North Nashville. And it was a great experience, and it taught me a lot, and it kind of opened a lot of doors into civic life. I got invited by Mayor Carl Dean to join his Nashville MTA board of directors. So I had gone from a committed user of transit in the city to helping make policy decisions about how we do better on transit in the city. And for 7 straight years, Mayor Dean invested incrementally in transit, and we saw our ridership growth grow faster than our population growth. And then I thought running for council connected all these issues I was interested in. We kind of wound up in the neighborhood we did because of transit issues. We also were in a working class, diverse neighborhood, partly because Whitney had gotten into Meharry for medical college. I got invited by neighbors to take on a leadership role in the neighborhood. We had the Nashville Rescue Mission there, so we're kind of grappling right across from Cheatham Place, which is an MDHA community with very low income and frequently homeless people. And Metro Action Commission was also in the neighborhood. And while we were having that conversation and working with them, they worked on this poverty reduction initiative. And so I was kind of seeing all of this happen. Meanwhile, our biggest neighbor to the east was Metro Water. I got involved in a citizens advisory committee with them to look at trying to prevent raw sewage from flowing into the Cumberland River when it rains really hard. And that was an interesting project. And so by the time 2015 came around, I realized that council was an opportunity to amplify a lot of the conversations I was already involved in. So 2015, my predecessor, Erica Gilmore, was term limited. She was going to run for at-large Metro Council. I had a conversation with a bunch of my neighbors and looked like it would be possible to have the conversation I wanted to have with the whole district. And we went out and won a council race. So It's been an exciting 8 years, and now here I am running for mayor.
So you mentioned that you were living in other places. Where did you live, and what did you learn from those experiences?
Yeah, so I went to Brown University, which is up in Providence, Rhode Island. And Providence is really interesting because it's on both the Amtrak corridor connecting D.C. to Boston, and we could go to all of the big East Coast cities. My friends and I, and some friends from here that were in any of those East Coast cities, we could stay pretty easily connected because we had Amtrak service. So, right, great passenger rail. So at least once or twice a semester, we'd go up the coast into Boston. We'd go down the coast into New York, sometimes all the way down to D.C. But you could also do it by bus and be even a little bit cheaper. We had, at the time, Bonanza and Peter Pan and even the Chinatown bus and a couple of the regional buses up there. So you could very inexpensively experience not just kind of regional transportation in that way, but also the big cities. So I got to spend time in DC, in New York, in Boston, experience what transit was like in those cities. Providence was a little bit smaller, but it was also, while I was there, kind of undergoing an urban renaissance. Buddy Cianci, who, while he was a problematic mayor, who wound up having a kind of a catastrophic scandal that wound up taking his administration down, he still managed to somehow preside over a lot of core investments in downtown, get Providence's kind of arts and theater community elevated. They started this riverfront reinvestment process that resulted in a kind of arts-focused event that is still going on today, decades later, called Waterfire, which brings people onto the river. They have gondolas, and they literally light kind of miniature bonfires up and down the waterfront. They had a new skating rink. They reinvented the kind of transit plaza downtown. They built this somewhat controversial Providence Place Mall, a very urban shopping center. But as they did all these things, you also saw in Providence leading indicators of what we were about to see in Nashville, which was making core investments in the urban environment means that your downtown, which Providence was actually very similar to Nashville back then, it had been historically for the decades leading up to when I got there, mostly commercial office buildings downtown, and the city itself kind of cleared out after 5 o'clock. All of this investment brought people back into the city, and suddenly you had restaurants downtown, bars downtown, just kind of a nightlife, and people downtown. And so it was interesting to kind of get back here and see that building Bridgestone Arena and seeing, an era of kind of adult bookstores and peep shows on Broadway give way to not just one or two, and now apparently an unlimited number of honky tonks, right? But I remember in high school, you would occasionally have cruising on Second Avenue, and we went through this period where you'd have a no
Dancing in the District.
Dance in the District. I saw a bunch of shows down on the old Riverfront Park before there was an Ascend Amphitheater, and so you do learn a lot about what works in cities, and so it's still striking to me that here, not just 40 plus years after I grew up here, but 20 plus years after I started riding the bus here, we've barely made a dent in one of our key quality of life, cost of living, overall accessibility things, and that's transit. And so it's one of the things I want to work on.
Yeah. So what would you do for transit? What would be your plan?
There's kind of a near-term and a longer-term approach. So I left the Nashville MTA Board of Directors running for council, winning that seat, and you can't do both. And so I had to resign my seat on the MTA board. But one of the things we were working on right before I left was our first ever long-range strategic plan called In Motion. It still exists today. It's still a good basis for any future work that gets done. But there was a steering committee that was a part of that, and they, a couple years into the council term, put on everybody's desk, including the mayor's, a really smart idea, which is this is a 3-year work plan for useful, visible, popular, cost-effective things we can do that will elevate the stable base of ridership we're trying to create, right? It's building a few more community transit centers in communities that we know need them so that not everybody who gets on a bus has to come into downtown before they go back out to some other part of the city. Most other cities have figured this out. It's building the crosstown capacity and the frequency to do that. And the good news about that plan was that it fit into what Mayor Dean had already been doing effectively, which is a slightly larger set of incremental investments, but one that fits within our ordinary operating budget, right? It's not something that would require any special funding or a property tax increase or anything like that. It's just a slightly larger slice of the pie. Now, what Mayor Barry tried to do was to shoot the moon on transit and secure dedicated funding for it with a referendum with a very ambitious plan. Now, I think what we should do this time is the walk and chew gum approach, where we do this work plan. We finish community transit centers. We put one here on the East Bank now that we're master developer for a lot of reclaimed public land with the Titans Stadium deal done. We just bought a mall in Southeast Nashville. We can and should put a community transit center there. The convention center already owns land that is anticipated to be one. These are things I thought might actually happen already when we got a bunch of one-time federal money in the form of the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act. We missed some opportunities over the past few years. I don't want to miss those opportunities ahead because we have both the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, two other big federal opportunities that Nashville needs to take advantage of. If we do all of that and build those community transit centers, strengthen our frequency and crosstown capacity so that we can do things like get buses to and from the soccer stadium during games, I think we'll be really well prepared to reinvest in a conversation about dedicated funding and a more reasonable plan.
So community transit, like what exactly does that mean? Like is that buses going from place to place? Like where would they go to and from?
Right. So if you go down to the new Hillsborough High School right now in Green Hills, you'll see climate controlled waiting rooms, much more visibility into when and where buses are going. It's a place that multiple routes can terminate and originate outside of downtown. And eventually, if you do it right, you'd run a route basically directly from Green Hills, for instance, to Antioch, or Green Hills up to, we're building another community transit center like the one in Green Hills on Clarksville Highway in North Nashville, so that you could get directly from North Nashville to Green Hills without having to do this expensive come into the center of the city and go back out and fight through that traffic.
It's not like a new lane like the AMP like it was.
Yeah, this would be more traditional bus-based service. I think then you'd also be looking to graduate to something called bus rapid transit in an ideal scenario, you might have dedicated lanes for transit, emergency vehicles, some other specialty scenarios. Um, but you can still make headway on a corridor like Gallatin, like Charlotte, like Murfreesboro, where you also modernize your traffic signals. And this helps motorists because we've got a traffic management center that we can simultaneously invest in. Now you're not stuck at a red light if you're driving your car when nobody's coming the other way.
How would that? I mean, so and Matt Wilshire and Alice Rowley mentioned the same thing. Like we've got to modernize that. How much would that actually affect the traffic flow?
It's a big deal. And so I'm going to give Mayor Cooper some credit because he already initiated the process of traffic management. Years ago, there was this moment where Public Works put out a big press release of, hey, we just retimed the traffic signals. Well, that's nice, but we have, I mean, I say this as a software guy, better than manually retiming every traffic signal in the city is when the traffic signals themselves know where the traffic is.
Yeah.
If the traffic signal knows that I just passed through one intersection, there's nobody coming in either direction at the intersection in front of me, and ordinarily it might be like, oh, time to change to red. Well, now it knows where the traffic is flowing, and it can let traffic on Broadway or Nolensville or whatever corridor in the city flow a little better. So it's actually great to try to do all these things in a coordinated fashion.
Sure.
Now that we have a Nashville Department of Transportation, building out that traffic management center capacity, modernizing our traffic signals helps traditional motorists, but it also helps transit because as we modernize our fleet, the buses can say, hey, the light is about to turn red. We're behind schedule, stay green a little longer, just long enough to let us get through the intersection. And now you're improving transit flow as well so that you're not stuck in traffic there.
Yeah. And so, you said short term. What about the long-term plan?
So the long-term plan would look more intensely at bus rapid transit. And this is effectively trains on rubber wheels. And we did years ago when I was still on the MTA board, a local preferred alternatives analysis. And what we learned through that was there are a couple of advantages to BRT. You get a lower cost per mile. You don't sacrifice anything on return on investment where you can, for instance, build affordable housing on the corridors. You can get a great kind of retail response to a place where people know there's going to be heavy transit ridership. You get a lot of amenities out of actually having transit on a corridor like Murfreesboro, like Gallatin, like Charlotte, like Broadway. Vanderbilt is the largest transit trip generator in the region. Murfreesboro and Gallatin tend to still be the highest ridership routes in the city. If we did gold standard bus rapid transit, where you had enough curb to curb width where you could do a dedicated lane, if we build the East Bank right, you can really start to see a more contemporary approach to transit that connects multiple parts of the city, has some high capacity modes of transit like BRT, and eventually I think you could probably graduate to the one light rail route that I think the city needs most, which is the airport to potentially both downtown and the East Bank.
Yeah, and so what other cities have done the bus rapid transit, and how's it worked? I'm sure some places it's worked well, maybe others not as well. What's
almost everywhere that does it, they get a very successful response. The two that I've ridden personally, actually, there's three. I have ridden it in Cleveland, which was the first city I went to 15 years ago. They've got the Health Line. It's kind of mostly a straight shot route, but it is exactly what I described. It feels just like a train on rubber wheels, but it moves people so efficiently. Like it's a really well done urban implementation. Surprisingly, considering it's mostly a college town in Oregon, Eugene, Oregon has a really great dedicated lanes based bus rapid transit implementation. Portland has one too, but more cities are getting there. In fact, I'm a little disappointed in some ways, without trying to be disrespectful to Memphis. This was something that as the capital city, as the major economic force in the city, in the state, I expected Nashville to be leading on issues of transit and infrastructure. Memphis is about to have a bus rapid transit implementation before Nashville is, and I feel like this is unfortunate because we're kind of watching Memphis beat us in leading in that. We're watching Chattanooga beat us in active transportation infrastructure. And when I first got invested in these things, Nashville really seemed poised to lead not just Tennessee, but the Southeast in some of this common sense stuff that we've watched everywhere around the country, the studies show you the same thing. The economic development response to transit and safe infrastructure that supports active transportation, walking, biking, these days using a scooter, whatever, all of that stuff actually creates a really vibrant local economy response where small businesses thrive. You tend to get overall more turnover into businesses like retail and restaurants. And so we're starting to lag. We're missing our opportunities. We watched $75 million that we had in a federal budget walk to some other city to go implement this when we didn't invest in the AMP. We have missed multiple federal grant opportunities for infrastructure over the past 3 years, and I want to be extremely serious and diligent as a mayor about not leaving money on the table. We have just missed an incredible number of federal, state, and similar opportunities to bring money into the city, and I think we need to perform better.
Well, how long would it take, though, to do something like that? Would we be able to do it in an 8-year term? Or
Oh yeah, I mean, if we had, for instance, completed even just the single route of the AMP that Mayor Dean had proposed a decade ago, we'd be riding it today.
Sure.
From 5 Points to St. Thomas West, you'd have an extremely quick and efficient transit route on the densest part of the city. If we're serious about this, we can do within a single term, you would see more community transit centers and crosstown capacity for traditional bus service. Within 2 terms, if we go with a community-based plan that doesn't overinvest in light rail or have secret billion-dollar tunnels under downtown and is half the cost or less to get bus rapid transit as a demonstration project on key routes, you could have people riding it within 2 terms.
And so, I mean, when I think of buses and light rail, I think of old, like, 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And, I feel like we might have missed our mark 10 years ago, and it might be too late. And I guess my thought on this is, how do we build a city of the future?
Yeah.
And we're going to have autonomous vehicles. AI is coming really fast. You're a computer scientist. I think you understand that. Could it be too late? And, do we pivot towards really building that city of the future? Because 20 years from now, this could all be obsolete.
There's never going to be a time, I can't imagine, because even as we made cars a commodity, they're still the second most expensive asset that people have. And unlike a home, they depreciate in value. They don't appreciate in value unless you manage to maintain a classic car, right?
Right.
Which a lot of people don't. And so if you go buy the cheapest vehicle on the market right now in the United States, the cost of owning, maintaining, fueling, and insuring that is still quite high. Even if we get to an autonomous vehicle future, and I had a really interesting conversation about this with Gabe Klein, who is one of the most innovative people that I've met and have watched his career for a long time. He was one of the guys who was, I think, a co-founder, at least senior executive at Zipcar years ago. And he has worked on everything from bike share to autonomous vehicle preparation to big infrastructure projects in big cities, from DC to Chicago. Zipcar was based out of Boston. He came here to talk, and he actually worked on a program with Nashville as a kind of consultant to the city called Gear Up 2020 a few years ago. And his outlook was, yes, modern American cities should be preparing for automatic vehicles. And in fact, the Berry administration was working on that. And when I say the dedicated lanes for emergency vehicles and so forth, they can actually also be used for AV support. And that's a really good way to blend that into the system. But he said, and this is, I fundamentally agree with him, you shouldn't ever think about that future without a mass transit capability, because it's always going to be the most efficient way to move people. For the individuals who are being moved, it's still going to be far cheaper to do that than to ever own even like an entry point automated vehicle. Even if you went into something that was like a multi-vehicle chain or whatever, or Lyft and those kinds of things, if you think about where we are right now as a city and the struggle for the hospitality and healthcare industries to maintain a workforce, part of it is because either parking in the urban center from Vanderbilt to downtown over here in East Nashville, or using ride sharing and other services on a daily basis, the rates are pretty extraordinary. They're pretty expensive. Whereas if you can rely on a meaningful transit system, you can cut your household costs dramatically. And so from a standpoint of public service delivery, it's still going to be really important into the future. And transit can take advantage of all the technology that's out there too. I mean, you could imagine someday having automated mass transit.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's what I think it is. And it does make sense if you already had that lane, you'd have a way. I do wonder if it is too far, because the AI is coming so fast.
Yeah.
I mean, there's obvious debates on how fast, but and I think it's important right now for whoever's voting to look at the mayor, like how are they going to be a mayor of the future? Because these really are revolutionary times.
Future readiness is one of the things that I think best positions me, because I have spent so long in the software and technology industry. I've thought a lot about resilience. In fact, Mayor Barry did a really smart thing a few years ago by creating an Office of Resiliency within the mayor's office. And it was looking at stuff like this. It was looking at everything from, climate mitigation and severe weather to global pandemics and the impact thereof before we had COVID. It was looking at disruptive technologies, and it's really important for cities to be able to maintain a long view. And that's one of the things I want to specifically bring to the table here.
There's a lot of talk, obviously, on affordable housing, and it's a big issue for the city. What would what would your definition of affordable housing be?
Yeah, this is maybe the most important way to think about this too. I would say in the practice of housing and building, developing, and kind of thinking about policy, the overall outlook is if you are spending more than 30% of your take-home pay on your housing, you are cost burdened and your housing is not affordable. So for instance, when I was 30 years old and we were a single income household because Whitney was in med school and I had just bought a house, there was a moment before she had completed her medical education and residency where we were probably cost burdened because we had bought a house. It was before interest rates had kind of come down to an exceptionally low point. And so the monthly payment was a little higher. And, we were a single income household. So arguably, though, I had bought a little more house than we needed. I had kind of pushed it at the stretch level. And as our income volatility, as a couple of young people finding their professional footing, there were periods where you could argue that we weren't in an affordable home. Or if you are coming to Nashville and you're hoping to make it as a songwriter and you're working as a host or hostess, as a server, whatever, you're in some segment of our hospitality industry, you're making good tips, but you're in the hourly wage marketplace, and you're paying $2,200 for an apartment with a roommate, chances are you're going to discover that that's not affordable housing. There's not a kind of one size fits all. And if you look at the kind of buckets of income that people tend to fall into, you could be making $0 to 30% of area median income. That tends to be where very low income affordable housing is targeted. 30 to 60% of area median income, and then 60 to 120%, you may be looking at workforce housing, middle class housing, and then anything up above that, you're making incomes where you kind of get to choose where you are on the affordability piece. But there's not really just, hey, $400 a month is affordable housing, and that's all you say about it. It tends to be based on how large is your family, what's the overall household income, what is your take-home pay, and really at the end of the day, are you spending more than 30% of what you earn on your housing?
Yeah. So, what would be your approach to make housing more affordable in the city?
Yeah. So the good news is we have a very good affordable housing task force report that came out a couple of years ago. It had some key recommendations in it. We just completed one of the core recommendations there, which is to, for 3 years in a row, invest $30 million into the Barnes Housing Trust Fund. This is a fund that nonprofit typically, but for-profit too, affordable housing developers can go make applications for long-term affordable housing projects. Typically, any dollar they take out of that fund, they can go leverage up to 6 times in the market to draw in other leveraged sources of financing and go build housing that they can then maintain at below market rates. The trust fund has provided thousands of units over the entire period of its existence. And as we've grown it, the reason this matters is for the first time this year, based on all the investments we've made in that affordable housing toolkit, and I was proud to be a part of a council-led effort for the 2 previous years to make sure we hit that $30 million mark, but we did. And this year, the mayor started at that point himself. And so as a partnership, we've gotten that key recommendation met. And it means for the first time, we are closing the gap between the number of total housing units we know we need and the supply we're bringing into the pipeline. So that's good news. Almost every recommendation of that task force report is actually in progress or about to start. Like there's a catalyst fund in there that will allow Metro, it's got a $20 million initial investment. It's going to allow Metro to acquire land that becomes available that may not hit the open market yet, that then the private sector can come in and again partner to create long-term affordable housing on land that the strike fund acquires. That's going to be a big new tool that we've added. We've got a community land trust that's built a few homes. I want to see that capacity expand. But we also created a housing division within the Metro Planning Department. They are underway right now with a unified study, and I think that unified study is going to be a very great roadmap for the other approaches we should be taking, funding levels we should be thinking about, policy changes we should be considering. So I am eagerly awaiting that unified study, and while we wait for it, we're going to continue taking steps in the direction of the things that are already key recommendations of that task force report.
So Envision Casey, not much has happened to me, unfortunately. I don't know your position on it. What would you continue that project or?
Yeah, so this one's tough because when Envision Casey started, it did take advantage of an innovative program that was administered through HUD. It was called Rental Assistance Demonstration, and it basically allowed MDHA, our local housing authority, to, instead of having the federal government own that land and have MDHA effectively be the landlord, MDHA could take ownership of the land, go capitalize, and begin construction of new affordable housing, which had not happened in a generation, really. I mean, we were effectively losing affordable housing supply by not growing any of our public housing capacity over the past several decades. Envision Casey has added several hundred new units of mixed income housing. That's a good thing. When it began, though, the plan was not to add any additional very low income affordable units, right? So it was, yeah, we're deconcentrating poverty by bringing more types of housing into the overall Casey reinvention, but you're not actually increasing the supply of affordable housing. Fortunately, MDHA has since changed that pathway. It's on the move, but we also need to look across the board, including across the river. We've already been through 2 other Envision planning scenarios, Napier and Sudicum, which is what I represent in the kind of southeast part of District 19. Also Envision Edge Hill, which is over by the Edge Hill Apartments, which is in District 17, represented by Councilmember Sledge. We've each been deeply involved in community discussions that played out over the past 5 years, but we haven't taken a single step in the construction process for that, right? And so this is where one of the key things that the mayor has to do going forward is actually reestablish a functional partnership between Metro and MDHA so that we can actually supply, as a part of our affordable housing toolkit, either some of the infrastructure support or, and possibly, local funding, because when we've done that in the past, we've created great mixed income communities like Randy Rogers right on Roselle Parks Boulevard, which took over an old underused training facility and created a community of 100 mixed income apartments right on a major corridor, walking distance to a grocery store, walking distance to multiple community amenities. And that was aided by $25 million in general obligation bonds that was just part of our overall capital spending. So that it's another tool in the toolkit, and we ought to reinvest in that.
Yeah, but I wonder, you talk about other boards have been set up and those type of things, but it seems like so much red tape and bureaucracy that it doesn't get done. It's great if we make another plan, but the plan gets people excited. I like this plan because it wasn't displacing people.
Yeah.
It allowed people to stay in their neighborhood, which is super important.
Yep.
And to me, it's a travesty that these things don't get done. Like, what do we have to do as a city to get those important things done?
So I a few weeks ago, put out a list of 15 fixes. And one of the biggest things on that list is going back to something that Mayor Dean had initiated, which is, honestly, it is a process of cutting red tape. In many cases, Metro is the obstacle to slowing down delivery of affordable housing, whether it's because we get in our own way from an infrastructure perspective and changes in Metro water policy for helping get infrastructure costs paid for slow something down. I've been working on a project for months that's stuck in those gears. I'm actually working on some legislation to try to unstick that. There are scenarios where any of a mix of codes, the Nashville Department of Transportation, known as NDOT, NES, the fire marshal, water, those 5 departments tend to be involved in any development scenario. And we need to be looking at ways where we are fundamentally accelerating projects like Envision projects under MDHA, any Barnes-funded project in the city, any project that's qualified for a mixed income payment in lieu of taxes, which is another great tool we just implemented. Metro should be trying to catalyze, not red tapeify the delivery of affordable housing. It's a big issue right now.
Well, I look at what's happened with codes, and they've had it hard up there. They need more people. And so, and I know, and we'll get into the whole building of Nashville in a little bit, but I think we should at least agree that it shouldn't be a hassle to get things done because we don't have enough people. So what would you do to support, fixing that?
So the good news is, though I almost had a heart attack when Bill Herbert, the outgoing director of codes, and Emily Lamb, his deputy director, did something I've never seen happen in Metro. They walked out the door at the same time. Now, I don't blame them because I've known Bill for years, and he felt just absolutely strapped, to your point, that there were some significant personnel issues. But before he left on our desks a great report that he had worked on that talked about personnel needs. And again, I will give Mayor Cooper some credit. Over the past 2 fiscal years, including in this FY24 budget, which just started on July 1, and which the mayor will inherit in October and work on through the rest of the fiscal year on June 30th. These 2 fiscal years have enough positions for planning, codes, and NDOT in particular to increase their permitting process, the inspection process, and the planning capacity process. As long as we are able to keep up with the kind of war for talent that's out there, and we keep Metro pay scales competitive with the market, and that's cost of living, that's everything else, we've got the capacity to relieve some of those personnel pressures. This is actually a very good thing. And credit to Bill Herbert and Emily for working on that so intensively, and credit to Mayor Cooper and my council partners on agreeing that that was a priority.
Yeah, I hear it a lot, and I know it's painful. And you think about the morale too.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't consider, if you look at what's going on in a city or a country or a state, you don't consider the morale of the workers. And in certain departments of the city, the morale is not the best.
Yes.
How can you help? How would you help the morale if you're mayor?
So we've talked a lot about this, and I think some of it really does start at the top. This has been, and I'm going to give a lot of grace here, this has been a very, very difficult period of Nashville's existence to govern through. 2020 alone as a year was a devastating tornado, a global pandemic that dropped by the end of the following week and started to change even the ability to recover from the tornado. In the middle of that, series of straight line windstorms that knocked 100,000 people out of power after some of them had just gotten it back after the tornado. A surprising amount of civil unrest from events that had happened across the country. And again, that was all with the backdrop of the pandemic. And then ending the year with this just absolutely insane and fortunately not with loss of life, but from a property standpoint, devastating bombing on 2nd Avenue. That was all one single year of our city. Then this year, even before the term is out, we have the tragic and just awful, like traumatic shooting at Covenant. And so I do think that, I'll say it this way, as we have had our conversation with the city over the past year, taking all of that into account, there's a surprising amount of readiness to be hopeful again. I think people know that we can do better. We've seen ourselves do better at managing the city. And I think against the backdrop of all that chaos, this has been a tough administration to keep intact. And so you've seen more turnover than usual out of the mayor's office, but I think we've got an opportunity now to create a stable 4-year team that is really there. I will say I'm very proud of the team that we've built to get this campaign working so effectively. And I think what I've experienced is when people come interact with our team on this campaign, we've had more than 200 volunteers come join us over the past few weeks, logging more than 1,000 hours of volunteer time. And their experience is they're doing something in many cases that they've never done, which is talk directly to other Nashvillians about their concerns and ideas. And they're working hard, but they're telling us they're having fun and they keep coming back for more. I think the same can be true within Metro. If we just remind ourselves of the spirit of service and being civil servants, and we elevate not just first responders, but also teachers, and we elevate the people that are really in frontline customer service roles, that's one of the things I want out of the next few years is for Metro to be one of the top tier customer service organizations in the city. And I think if we're delivering on that and people are having positive interactions with the city, whether it's, getting a pothole filled or a street light fixed or a sidewalk repaired, or going through the process of getting minor construction, like if they're adding a deck to their home or, building a new home or building an apartment for grandma, whatever it might be, if that's a positive experience, the morale lifts on both sides. It lifts on the Metro employee side and it lifts on the resident side. And I think both of those things are really important goals because if nothing else, by the end of 4 years, I want Nashvillians to be agreeing that we are back on the right track because for 5 years, we have felt like we're on the wrong track.
Yeah, no, Nashville it's been through really a tremendous amount. You think about, the things that you just said. We had the tornado, then a week later, COVID. And then the crazy one, it was like the icing on the cake per se, that the bombing, it was like constant, like it was tough. And so it was kind of like a rattling, situation.
It really was. And I will say, most of those events, including a lot of the elements of civil unrest, had their epicenter in District 19, which I represent. And it's not something I expected, but I will say it has turned out to be a useful portfolio of skills to have now been through crisis response a number of times. And I think that's not something that a lot of people have as much direct exposure with. I've had to deal with displacement of hundreds of my constituents, mass displacement in many cases where entire buildings full of people got leveled. I mean, that's the lesser known story of the bombing was hundreds of people lost their homes into 17-degree weather on Christmas Day. Dealing with that and working with the American Red Cross as a key partner, working now that we have a housing division, one of the things I want to think about is how we better respond to those kinds of things, to displacement. I want to use the powers of the mayor's office to coordinate around moments like that as effectively as possible.
What's going on with Second Avenue? I guess you said you were a bike rider. I didn't know that. I have 3 electric bikes downstairs, so my friends can go with me.
Yeah.
But I drive by Second Avenue, Second Avenue all the time.
Yep.
And we're coming up on 3 years. It doesn't seem to me like anything's been done. Where are we at with that?
So the hardest part about this, from working through the Second Avenue recovery process, a couple good things. And I'll shout out the mayor on both the seriousness and dedication of his response to the recovery effort. You may have seen one really good thing is the bombing itself occurred closest to the AT&T facility there. Mm-hmm. They have now completely renovated that, and they actually have the largest piece of Phil Ponder art that we just installed on the side of that building. And so they have kind of completed their piece in this phase, and they've done the internal and exterior work. And honestly, that piece of Second Avenue looks better than it probably ever did in my lifetime before that, because it was otherwise a boring faceless wall, and now it's got a legendary Nashvillians original art kind of put up on it. If you are south of Commerce Street, everything that sustained damage from Mike's Ice Cream to the Wild Horse Saloon, they are back open for business. The hardest part is that couple of blocks from Commerce up to Union. And I will tell you, one of the hardest parts has been working with the insurance companies. I have spoken to property owners up and down that stretch of 2nd Avenue, and the insurance companies are being unusually terrible for people who have just lost not just their homes, but in many cases their livelihoods. There's no lack of commitment on the part of Metro. First, the mayor tapped Ron Gobble to be a project manager who did a fantastic job kind of coordinating property ownership. Now we've moved on to MDHA actually coordinating with planning to do a lot of the follow-up work. A wonderful woman, Michelle Scopel, is working on that. They've coordinated a whole bunch of things where we hope to improve just little things like solid waste management for a tough part of the city that doesn't always have alleys and has back of house has been on First Avenue for a long time. I think the mayor had the right vision of trying to connect up. If we do this right, in a few years, you will be able to walk from Representative John Lewis Way, formerly known as Fifth Avenue of the Arts, through the completely restored arcade, through a network of interesting alleys like Banker's Alley, all the way down to Butler's Run, and get down to the river. And it's going to be this really interesting urban experience with a restored 2nd Avenue. But there is the unfortunate process of working through the insurance thing.
So it's just the insurance that's holding it up. And I'm guessing that you have individual insurance for each of the residences and businesses, and they've got to figure out how to work together.
Those were condoed out, right? So if you had the quarters, there were multiple individual property owners in a building like that. They are all waiting on settlements right now. And we have to still get the coordinated response right so that NES is a good partner, so that between them, Metro Codes and Metro Historic are good partners. But this is where Michelle Scopel's efforts have paid off. The streetscape designs have been finalized. Nashville Department of Transportation is doing really good work there. I think by the end of this year, you'll see even further progress beyond what we've seen with Phil Ponder's art on the AT&T building. I think we're going to see improved streetscapes up and down it. You'll know when all the fencing comes down and 2nd Avenue itself is fully open to both foot and vehicular traffic. That's going to be one of the biggest signs that, yes, we're bouncing back all the way.
Yeah, it's telling to me. Yeah. I know you say it's great that AT&T is up, but it's telling that you have a big corporation has their stuff together, and the small businesses and the people that really are affected the most. AT&T can go into offices anywhere. It's, but and I know you say it's insurance companies. There's got to be something that the city can do to hold the insurance companies accountable if they're holding it up.
There's surprisingly little, and I say this from having talked to both the Metro Council Legal Office, Metro Legal as an entity. I have worked with private sector attorneys on some of these conversations. I have personally intervened. I've done site visits with the insurance companies. It is challenging, and it's not the kind of thing where Metro can easily, on behalf of all these property owners, kind of go put its own leverage on the line. We looked at property tax relief, but we've started to do an expedited permit process. I mean, we've tried to take every common sense approach to accelerate this. But the reason that AT&T piece was easier was they were the sole owner of a large building, and they had deep enough pockets that they didn't have to wait for a settlement to come through. Sense. Smaller individual property owners can't just go get over leveraged to rebuild all of that stuff. And Metro can't, on their behalf, go create all the financing streams for the redevelopment, but we can be a partner in it.
Sure.
We've just got to wait for, and you'll see it on a piecemeal basis. Also, some property owners are more eager to move than others, and so that's why you've seen a little bit of a different pace. Like some buildings are back online and open, and others may take a little longer.
Yeah, I see that big giant,
I know
hole.
It's the hardest thing.
It's hard. Yeah, it's hard to see every time. And I hear what you're saying that there's not a whole lot the government can do that does that does make sense. I just hope that when the insurance companies say go,
Yeah.
the city steps up and says, we're not going to hold you up 1 minute.
As a council member through the end of this term, as a mayor, I hope I get the opportunity to do this. We are going to make sure we take every step possible we can in partnership with those property owners.
Good. Let's go in the stadium. You were the only you're the only candidate that opposed the stadium being built, the new stadium being built.
Jim Gingrich, and it's not that I opposed the stadium being built; it's that I opposed the deal, the terms of the deal.
Okay, so you thought that you understood that we had to do something with the old stadium, no matter what. It was going to cost a certain amount of money.
Right.
Okay, so what kind of deal would you have made if you were mayor?
So I don't know everything that happened. We may never know the entire story, but here's what I can tell you about what I experienced personally. Just over 18 months ago, I sat down with the team and people working with them to review a proposal for a package of $600 million in upgrades to the existing stadium. Just a few weeks later, suddenly it was a $2.2 billion fully enclosed stadium that seemed to have had quite a bit of work already done with the state of Tennessee to offer part of that financing.
Wait, what did it start at? I'm sorry?
$600 million for upgrades to the existing stadium.
I see.
Split down the middle. It was a 50-50 deal.
Okay.
That's, from a public investment standpoint, not even as significant as the convention center.
Sure.
I thought, great, we can start this conversation easily because that will complete the lease. That'll take us out through 2039. Everybody seems to be very satisfied with this. Just a few weeks later, it might have even been before spring had arrived, we had a $2.2 billion initial cost of construction proposal that already, if you just look at the initial cost of construction, would have amounted to the largest public subsidy for an NFL stadium in the history of the NFL. Meanwhile, we're looking around the country at multiple privately funded or majority privately funded stadiums. We weren't even hitting the 50% mark. Between the state and local contributions, we were, as taxpayers, putting up the majority of the capital for that initial cost of construction. But it got worse from there. Once we saw the total expected revenue that came through the East Bank Stadium committee process, it amounted to $3.5 billion of revenue accumulated over the 30-year terms of the New Deal, plus a capital improvements budget item for $500 million in infrastructure, which we will be on the hook for as a city. So no matter who takes office in October, the Titans are expecting to play in a new stadium by 2027. So the entire term, the future mayor is going to have to be working on infrastructure for the East Bank. I am not opposed to that, but it is absolutely not the case that took pressure off of the general fund to get us out from under the terms of a bad deal. It not only put a $3.5 billion 30-year term, which was twice as big as the $1.8 billion they asserted was going to be the actual cost of upgrading. We never got an answer to that question. We still don't know what our full legal liability was under the lease. And
you still don't know.
That is correct.
How's that?
Well, we asked that question. In fact, we put money in the budget last year to say, please answer this question. And the mayor's office did a different thing. They said, what would it cost to do the things that you would like to do to the new stadium? That is very different than understanding legal liability.
And what is, so when you're going through this process and you get these answers, which are, they're BS basically, what's the reason for that? They're just trying to push it through without the public knowing what's going on?
I can't answer that question. I can tell you the questions I asked, and I can tell you the answers I got back. But I can't tell you what the motivation or their reasons were. I mean, I will be the first to acknowledge that the terms of the old lease were not good for the city. It's unclear who was sort of liable for initiating the repairs and submitting invoices, right? Like, should Metro have pushed harder to do better maintenance? Because one of the key questions I asked too was, when we had consultants there helping us answer the question of what would you like in an upgraded stadium, which again is a very different question from what is our liability under the terms of the existing lease. I said, how long should a football stadium last? And they said 30 years. And I said, so we're getting about 2/3 of the life out of our stadium. Now, I don't know why that happened, right? there's probably a little bit of shared responsibility between the team and Metro and the Metro Sports Authority. But it was a more complicated conversation, I think, than just should we build a new stadium or not.
Yeah, well, when I hear answers like that, I'm not saying that it's right or wrong what they did. I don't know the details, but when I feel like we should get all the information in a clear way so the city can make a decision with being as informed as possible.
I'll say, by the time it was all said and done, I felt like I had enough information to conclude that this was not an appropriately good deal for the taxpayers of Metro to feel comfortable voting yes for it. And I'll give you the clearest reason why. My colleague, Brandon Taylor, put an amendment on the deal that effectively would have been like a rent on tickets that the team could have chosen to pass on to ticket buyers that made the deal substantially more like what the Predators did.
Okay.
The Predators have no taxpayer obligation in that facility for its current or future status. They have an amazing set of potential upgrades planned for the future Bridgestone Arena and their campus, and it will be entirely paid for by user fees on people using the facility. They're one of the top ticketed venues in the world, so it made a lot of sense as they looked at their forecast to do it that way. I think when this new Titans Stadium is fully enclosed, you're going to see far more capacity for ticket sales because it is enclosed. And so you'll see a variety of different types of events. There won't be as many concerns about weather. There may be some advantages to that. I've heard mixed reviews from sports fans. I mean, I know plenty of football fans who like an open-air stadium. I have been to both and don't have strong feelings about it from a fan experience. I've had fun in big arenas. I've had fun in open-air stadiums, so I can see either way. And I think the Nashville SC experience is a great fan experience, and that's an open-air stadium at Geodis Park. And, you know, by the time we got to the end of it, though, Councilmember Taylor's amendment showed that we had the capacity to negotiate more because while that amendment was not accepted as it was, a kind of response amendment demonstrated that we could get a return on our massive public investment. And so we did get an amendment on there that effectively will return $4 million a year back directly into Metro's coffers. While it's not everything we looked at, it showed clearly that there was more negotiation that could have been done and arguably should have been done.
But I guess the deal's done now.
The deal is done now.
And you can't go back and add a tax, or you can't add to ticket sales or anything like that?
I'll say it this way. I look at deals as, to me it is a case of, it is clear that a majority of my colleagues, it is clear that the mayor's office, is clear that the team, and certainly some people in the city were comfortable with this. Mm-hmm. I don't intend to try to unwind the deal. What I intend to do now is take the other good work that was done along the way in the East Bank Vision Plan and really try to take the best elements of that from both an ambitious affordable housing targets perspective and also a really elegant infrastructure perspective and try to make those successful.
How do you keep it from ending up like Envision Casey, to where we actually get, East Bank done?
So in this case, so I'll say it this way. MDHA, unlike Metro, while they do, collect rent as a landlord in some ways, their tenant population, it's not like they're not a for-profit entity, right? They're not like a large multifamily for-profit apartment complex. Their funding streams are complicated, and systematically for decades, the federal government has reduced funding flows into public housing. Metro as a government has significant operating and capital capacity that we get by having a large property tax base and sales taxes and activity taxes and those kinds of things. We have just become the master developer for hundreds of acres in the stadium footprint. As the master developer, it is going to be imperative, and one of the things I expect to have in our administration is a director of infrastructure and capital projects, because we're going to have to kind of keep pace as the Titans will be setting pace for their portion of the footprint to get a new stadium constructed by 2027. Metro is going to have to keep pace with the surrounding infrastructure and sequencing of the parcels through the master developer process to get that right. And we'll have to see what external market forces are, costs of construction, all of those things. But my hope is, as the person that I, hope I'm in a position to spearhead that master developer process, we should be setting our own pace and setting a standard for, we don't want this to be red tape. We don't want the Titans to be looking at us and saying, where are you guys? We absolutely want to keep pace with what they're doing to get the stadium open by 2027.
Yeah, Matt Wilshire was talking about making an arts district down there, and I know TPAC is mentioning is having some problems. Is that kind of part of your vision as well, or what kind of area would it be? They have affordable housing, of course, but what type of businesses would be there? I mean, I would love to see biotech.
Yeah.
Nashville is poised to be a biotech city. We have the largest hospital groups in the United States, and our biotech industry isn't that strong, but there's nothing that's really keeping us from doing that.
So I'll say it this way. One of the things that I thought was most compelling in the East Bank Vision Plan was this idea of a cluster of new neighborhoods. At its heart, and I know early in the going, the Titans kind of gave voice to a Wrigleyville atmosphere. I think having a series of urban neighborhoods anchored by very connective infrastructure that creates better pathways both into East Nashville and connecting to downtown is ideal. I do think there needs to be, the state of Tennessee has already committed substantial funding for a new home for TPAC. I would love to find them a home on the East Bank. I mentioned earlier, I think that's an appropriate home for an east of the river community transit center because there is so much public land. We know the Titans are interested in partnering with the city on some park space that could accommodate tailgating, which I think is important. We're gonna have to think about infrastructure scenarios that include multimodal capacity. There's a greenways network that's in there. I guess I would say it this way. I want to see something that celebrates the riverfront. One of my favorite cities in Tennessee is Chattanooga. They've done such a good job of creating an urban fabric that is adjacent to their riverfront. It's very accessible. It just feels like a place that you want to walk around and spend time. That's what I want to have on the East Bank. More than anything, what I want it to be is not a junior version of the entertainment district just across the river. I don't want a Broadway 2. I want something that is more conducive to living there. If we get creative opportunities for industry, I think that would be pretty cool. I have seen so many interesting maker spaces across the city, kind of modern industrial. I think there are some things that you could actually connect to the old riverfront era in that regard. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm opposed to the idea of biotech being there, but I don't necessarily want to prejudge what would be there, and I'd be happy to keep talking about that idea.
Yeah, I'd look at Nashville. I think it has more potential for biotech.
Yeah,
I mean, than pretty much any place. It's
I
poised for it.
It's true given what we have.
It
in
is.
The city
It's
right
wild
now.
that it's not a hub.
And major, colleges and universities that are producing great research and looking for translation opportunities.
Yes, yeah. Translational medicine. That's actually one of my main passions, and there's a lot of opportunity with that.
Yeah.
Your wife went to Meharry.
Yeah.
What was that experience like for her? And talk a little bit about your perspective of her experience with that, your experience with that as well, and opportunities to make General Hospital better.
Yeah, so that was one thing that was interesting, right? Meharry's teaching hospital was Nashville General. This is something that is very much going to be a near-term problem for the next administration because the lease with Meharry also ends in 2027. So we've got a few clocks that are ticking for the next mayor. One of them is the Titan Stadium opening in 2027. One of them is the lease at the Meharry facility that General occupies as a hospital, also ending in 2027. So we're going to have to figure out a new solution for Nashville's public safety net hospital. There are a couple ideas. The hospital authority itself is looking at land in Metro Center. It is currently owned by Metro Parks. I don't know how that conversation is going to go. I did sort of raise the question in the public conversation about an acquisition of Hickory Hollow Mall, which I did not support, to say, why did we kind of cherry pick VUMC as opposed to looking at, we know we've got a conversation unfolding about Nashville General. I think we have some opportunities there, but I want to look at the site selection process. I want to look at the overall hospital accommodation, like patient population and clinic plans. I want to see what Meharry what they have as capacity as a medical college. Whitney's experience there was very positive. She lucked into a really amazing class. She was class of 2011. They had a very cohesive bond as a class. One thing that was apparent to me, though, and as we kind of moved into the community around that time, was that unlike a lot of our other colleges and universities, the HBCU corridor along Jefferson Street does not have kind of those anchor third places. Like there's not a Hillsborough Village or the little area off of Granny White where the original Pizza Perfect used to be, and Copper Kettle and those kinds of places, coffee shops. Years ago, there was a Kijiji's Coffee on Jefferson Street, and there's Ye's over there now, but it's not the same kind of vibrant place where students and faculty spend a lot of time. In fact, Whitney had a lot of peers that would go across town to actually study in the Vanderbilt footprint on weekends, because there was kind of a lack of nightlife along Jefferson Street and close to campus. A lot of people would go to Atlanta or St. Louis. And so it was a really instructive look at the kind of cultural ecosystem around our HBCUs. But her overall experience was very positive. In some ways, I think that the exposure she got into clinics wound up changing her life, because one of her mentors on the pediatric side encouraged her to go do an away rotation at Vanderbilt to look at pediatric neurology, and that became her specialty. And so now she's practicing at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital in the pediatric neurology division.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's got so much potential. And I wonder, there's these old hospital models, and to me, that's an old hospital model. But you have the historic Black Medical School right there. Yep. And I think you can make it even more appealing by, putting translational science in there. Like why, for instance, why not put a genomics lab? I mean, it's not that expensive. We're talking about spending hundreds of millions of dollars on things. You could put an amazing genomics lab in there for $10 million and serve the underprivileged, because they don't have access to this stuff. And we know next generation sequencing is the future. I mean, well, it's here right now. And we can make discoveries. We can raise their level of healthcare. We can match specific drugs with their genetics. Have you thought about doing something like that? Or
I haven't thought about necessarily that as a public investment strategy or even the way it partners, but I think to your point, looking at the future of biotech, and especially the fact that we've got some really innovative manufacturing concepts happening here that live right at the space of technology and healthcare, I think there is an opportunity there. I will say, I think one of the biggest decisions that needs to get made is, if we look at models of healthcare delivery that are working in other major cities, very often the city does have a general hospital concept, but it's not specifically attached to any of the affiliate teaching hospitals. And so I'm wondering we kind of need to answer this question of, should whatever the future iteration be of a general hospital model here take place on Mehary's campus, or should it be at a more neutral location and Meharry continues to use it as a teaching facility? What does that access look like? And I will say, I think North Nashville has a strong preference for maintaining geographic access to that hospital in whatever form it might continue to exist. And so I think there's a couple questions about that, and that's why I think the site selection process is going to be as interesting. Now, I will say, Meharry is not just a medical college. It has graduate science programs. Fisk is very eager to do more with technology. They'd love to add a computer science curriculum. TSU has a very robust graduate program in the sciences. So I think across all of the HBCUs, there really is an opportunity for more translational capacity, and it could very well live on the site of a former general if that moves, or be a companion piece to it if we refactor it in some way. But I don't think that conversation is far enough along yet to know for sure.
Yeah, we have a great HSBCU community here in Nashville, and I don't think a lot of people even realize it. Well, what would you do for that community to support it even more?
So we've already done some important things, and I think this is something that Mayor Cooper and Fisk University and I worked pretty well together on, which was using some of our American Rescue Plan Act dollars to create an incubation center at Fisk. And so there will be a new, kind of entrepreneurship-focused community hub on Fisk campus that has some public funding. I think that's a big deal. One of the things I'm proudest of as I close out my 2 terms on the Metro Council here is another use of one-time federal money to do a one-time startup cost type of thing, which is the best thing you can do. It's hard to start what are really supposed to be sustained programs with one-time federal money. We've got a few of those out there lingering that I'm worried about its risk, but I wanted to look at a startup cost scenario. So we used a few $100,000s of American Rescue Plan Act money to get all 4 of our HBCUs, Fisk, Meharry, TSU, and American Baptist College, started up on We Go Ride. This allows faculty, staff, and students at all 4 of those colleges and universities to access transit where their student ID basically is their fare and the institutions pay an institutional rate. The startup costs tend to be the hardest part, and then once you've got it going, the institutions can factor it into their budget, but because the endowments tend to be smaller at HBCUs, they've lagged years behind their peers because Vanderbilt, Belmont, Lipscomb, and even Trevecca have all been participants in We Go Ride for a long time. This actually builds a stable transit ridership base across that major HBCU corridor along Jefferson Street, all the way from Fisk's campus to TSU's, but it also incorporates American Baptist, which is actually right up around the corner from the new Community Transit Center in North Nashville. When you stabilize that base of ridership for people who want to ride but are students and don't have a ton of disposable income, and staff and faculty who would love an opportunity to cut costs, this should pay off for years of both increased transit ridership but also increased equity across our HBCUs. And I think it's possible to look for more opportunities like that where we try to think about strategic needs that the historic challenges that collection of universities has faced, and see if Metro can be an appropriate partner to them.
So let's go on to education, public education. Obviously, a big issue. I went to public school in Nashville. Overton High School. Your mom was a teacher, and I'm proud of my education. I didn't go to college. I got in trouble when I was 20 years old. I got 8 years probation.
Wow.
Started my businesses afterwards. Look back to my coaches and teachers and a lot of the lessons that they taught me, and was overcome a lot of adversity. And I feel like it was, the education that I got in Nashville, really the relationships of people in the community that would lift me up, maybe at my lowest.
Yeah.
I think we're losing that now. As far as quality of education in the city, the literacy rate's not great. I know next year they're going to be doing a rating system. We're going to have an F rating system for Nashville public schools, from my understanding. It's a big problem. And what are you going to do to make it an education system? Yes, we pay the teachers the most, but that's obviously not enough to get the education these children deserve.
So I think I'll say a few things. Whatever we do from a core education policy perspective is going to have to be done in partnership with Metro schools. I mean, they operate as a nearby, but obviously very adjacent and collaborative entity to Metro, and we fund them. We're also going to have to contend with a lot of state intervention in education policy. And so we're going to have to carve out that pathway where we're looking to triangulate the mayor's office with state interest in educational policy and outcomes, and whatever the school district is looking at, from everything from talent recruitment and pedagogical scenarios. That's all going to have to be done collaboratively. I will say I think the strongest tools the mayor's office can offer to overall successes are looking at the big picture. And so I'll tell you a couple of stories that are things I want to do, and then we can look at a couple of the things that I think are also important from an overall standpoint. So we know that COVID was challenging, and we lost a lot of families from the schools that our daughters attended, right? Both of our girls have gone to Aiken Elementary, which is where I went, K through 6. It's currently a K through 5 school. Our older daughter is on to West End Middle School. overall, they have had fantastic experiences in metro schools. Now, the way I knew they were likely to have fantastic experiences in metro schools was that when Mayor Dean was in office, his administration partnered with metro schools to do this thing called a First Choice Festival. This put every school in the district, generally speaking, I mean, there may have been a handful that chose not to participate, but it did something really great. It kind of broke open the idea that any given school should assume that on the first day of school, students will walk through its doors, and instead said, what are you going to do to attract families to come to your school? Because this is a really important way to put your best foot forward. So that festival was great because I walked in and I discovered 20 schools that I would have been proud to send our daughter to. I went back a second year and I narrowed my list down to 6 schools that I would have been not just proud but excited to send her to, and those were schools we submitted into the open enrollment process. And we have found pathways for our daughters that not only are very convenient to our lives because their schools are very close to the Vanderbilt footprint, which is where Whitney works, and both of them had been through the Vanderbilt pre-K program. And my parents live just around the corner in Richland West End, and our older daughter was able to walk home from school on a nice Friday afternoon for the last couple of years to just go visit her grandparents. These are all great things, and we discovered that all by going and talking to school leaders, faculty, looking at programs. We're in an international baccalaureate program, which is great. International baccalaureate is, combined world language and culture, but also social and emotional learning. There's Montessori programs in metro schools. There's Paideia programs in metro schools. There's a Nashville School of the Arts. There are multiple pathways into magnet and arts programs. It's great to celebrate all of the options there. And I think one of the things that the mayor needs most to do is invite people back in to celebrate the excellence that does exist in metro schools. There are not only lots of great teachers, but also lots of great educational pathways, and it's really important to celebrate those, because one of the things that's been hardest for us as a metro government is chronic enrollment declines, even as our school-age population has increased, thanks in part to COVID and the response to that, but also looking at some of the, I think, overall perceptions about quality have meant that we've lost a lot of funding. And so one of the best ways to recover is to try to get people to come back in and experience metro schools. I would love for people's first choice, generally speaking, to be metro schools if it's at all reasonable from a household logistics and educational quality standpoint. Now, we also discovered in getting to Aiken that we weren't going to have access to aftercare because there is not a guaranteed aftercare spot for all students who enroll. Well, we found out the hard way that parents who lived in the neighborhood closest to the school had filled up all the aftercare years ago and got on wait lists basically when their kids were born. It took us 3 years to get off the wait list. Well, in that 3-year period, I was fighting and wound up basically losing a job over having to leave the office at 3 p.m. 2 to 3 days a week. But I didn't want to give up on the fight, and so I stayed and fought, and we got a second on-site aftercare program established at Aiken. This was a great way to pay it forward, and now dozens more families per year get to take advantage of 2 different aftercare programs at that school. The hard part was watching a couple years go by. Now both programs have wait lists. So there are still working families who cannot choose metro schools, and we've talked to several of them because they don't know what they're going to do with their kids after school, particularly at the elementary years. I do think it's critically important to lower barriers for working families to even be able to choose metro schools in the first place. Another example is we have the earliest high school start times in the country. This is not a good thing. 7 a.m. is when schools like Overton ring the bell, 6:55 technically. And it's bad for mental health. It's bad for student performance. It's bad for family environments to try to get kids up and running that early and figure out, again, the after-school scenario. So that's, by all accounts, a logistics issue that we can solve.
Yeah.
Metro can jump
Would you
in
move
and
the
do
time
that.
up?
Yeah, that's what I want to do.
What time would you, what do you think would be a good time?
I think 8 a.m. is the earliest we should ever expect high schools to start. And some of them do. The magnets frequently do start later than the the general high schools do, the comprehensive high schools. And so I think looking at a no later than 8 a.m. start time would be really, really helpful as a move in the right direction. Middle school start at 9 a.m. right now.
Yeah, that does make sense. I don't know. I'm remembering back to my Overton days, and I remember going to school at 7 a.m. You mentioned the effects COVID had on everything, and for a while, people would say trust science, and then I was like, this is no longer science. This is political science. And I felt like the school board held the political science over the kids' heads. I don't know your view on that. If you agree, would you have done something about it? If you don't, tell me why you don't.
So this was tough because I actually got into some pretty intense arguments with family friends who were in schools with us. And I mean, I'll say, we tend to be a pretty evidence-based household from a health and health sciences standpoint, just because there's a physician in the house. I remember distinctly when Whitney went to her first grand rounds about COVID, and I was like, oh my gosh, we are going to have to take this a lot more seriously than I think a lot of people are expecting to. And I kind of divide my outlook into this, the whole response to COVID, into pre-availability of vaccines and after the availability of vaccines. And I will say, for me, that first summer was specifically very scary because I had multiple friends who narrowly avoided going on ventilators despite having been perfectly healthy before they contracted COVID. I had a friend who recounted being in a bed in the Vanderbilt parking garage in their overflow healthcare scenario on oxygen, looking to his left and right and not sure he was going to live. And that's pretty terrifying that we could have lived through that. And I think it is interesting because I know there has been a lot of intense discussion about, hey, what's the evidence say about this? I still think one of the hardest parts about COVID is that the individual personal health response to it has been so chaotic. I mean, even this week, I've talked to a friend whose father is two friends whose parents are both experiencing the after effects in the form of long COVID in ways that is still, it's created chronic health conditions. And, I think once we got through the period where health providers and kind of frontline people in a variety of professions were vaccinated, and then I will say one thing I wish we had done earlier is prioritize the availability of vaccines to teachers. I also think the state got it wrong when they saw that supply was way over demand in outlying counties and demand was incredibly high in urban areas. They should have shifted the distribution of availability of vaccines to allow Nashvillians to get vaccinated sooner. I found vaccine availability for my parents outside of county. I found vaccine availability for my daughter's teacher outside of county. This is a little bit absurd when you've got a lot of people who do want to go back in. I will say we were guided by the timing of these things, and I will say our daughter struggled with distance learning. Her teacher did not want to be doing distance learning. As soon as it was clear that Metro could have done a hybrid model in the second semester, I think we should have just started the semester that way as soon as availability of vaccines was covered for any Metro schools teacher who wanted one.
Yeah, I know. Like with kids, Dr. Hildreth, I actually watched the FDA panel which he was on for the kids. I watched it twice at times too. It was like 7 hours. Yeah, and I appreciated what he said though. I was frustrated throughout the whole thing. Because I saw pretty early that it was political science, and there are. I don't believe science is consensus. There's an argument that science is consensus now, and it's an interesting debate. Yeah, but Dr. Hildreth said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, I'm going to vote for this, but I don't think, we're considering, or we should consider rather, that about 40 to 50% of the kids have already had COVID. So they had natural immunity. And, there were some of us that were saying that nonstop, like, well, we should consider natural immunity and these types of things. That's just one example of where it was political science. You couldn't say those things without being called anti-vax. I mean, I got called a right-wing Trump supporter. I got called a left-wing idiot. I got called all these things just for speaking the truth as I saw it, not, toting the status quo.
So I will say I was I took the most heat, I think, as a public figure thinking through public policy and health policy as it applied to the general public through a pandemic for not being a mandate enthusiast for masks. Because while we knew, I mean, while Whitney as a health professional could tell you that a fitted N95 mask is a good thing if you're going into a room where somebody has, for instance, tuberculosis or whatever.
Yeah.
And for COVID too, you know, like a surgical mask, certainly a cloth covering, these things are not going to be as good as a medically fitted N95 mask. I started looking very closely at things like ventilation and air quality studies. That's why I was very excited to see a building downtown actually achieve Fitwell status, because if you do some of these things, and I actually had some moderately productive but also moderately frustrating conversations about the Metro Schools plant process, about anything simple from opening windows or outdoor instruction, right? But also looking at reducing viral load systematically. Because reducing viral load at the building level helps everybody who enters the building, whether or not they choose to wear a mask. And certainly when our daughter was coming home kind of complaining that her peers didn't seem to be picking up the process of how to wear a mask appropriately. And that's the hardest part.
Yeah.
Anybody who's wearing a mask down here, you've like, that's already
contaminated.
Right. So it's, I mean, the exposure risk, a mask mandate turns out to be one of the most difficult things to enforce. And in fact, just socially, if you are trying to then have an argument with somebody who refuses to wear a mask, now someone's yelling, you're in a confrontational standpoint. Whereas if you're approaching it from the system of, have we brought the likelihood of viral load down from a facility standpoint, we've done a lot more. If we've opened windows, used HEPA filters, if we've maximized how safe the overall air that everyone is sharing is.
They'll do a lot more than a child wearing a mask. As you were saying, you know, if a kid's touching it constantly, if they're wearing it perfectly and they have an N95, sure, that's as good as it gets. But they were pushing cloth masks. That was the most offensive, because we knew. I mean, there was no scientific evidence that cloth masks work, and it became, you know. But if you said that, you got put in a camp, and you know, that kind of shows the divisiveness.
It was so divisive, because I had really good friends who were extremely frustrated with me that I was not calling aggressively for mask mandates. I got friends who were frustrated at me for listening to the voices of skeptics, because I was paying most attention to what the evidence highlighted. And there were times when it was like, yes, there were some orthodoxies that persisted that did not have their basis in even science, maybe not consensus, but at least looking at it. And so I was tracking all of those things. I was looking at mask quality, controls on that. I was looking at ventilation. I was looking at, you know, impact on kids. I mean, it's interesting. Through all of that, neither of our daughters ever contracted COVID in a school environment.
Nice. Yeah, so, I mean, what do you think about, you know, during that whole time, there was no, well, I shouldn't say no, there was very little talk about health, overall health. Imagine if we would have gone on a public health campaign where we say, you know, yes, it's dangerous for everybody. Even if you're healthy, you can have bad outcomes. But we know through the data, likely who's going to die of this. 65 and up, 80 to 90%. Obesity is a big problem. My best friend growing up, his dad was a teacher at Overton. He died of COVID. He was overweight. You know, so I absolutely, you know, acknowledge even from a personal standpoint how dangerous it was. But I thought the approach got so divisive, you couldn't have a conversation about health. And you know, think about if there was a health conversation. Go walk outside. They were telling people you can't go walk outside, which was pretty wild for a while in the very beginning. But you know, if there was a health conversation about diet, healthy foods, guess what? In 6 months, if you don't contract this and you lose 30 pounds, you have a more of a chance of being alive than even if you get the vaccine. And that is actually what, studies show. It was largely obesity and activity related as far as bad outcomes.
Yeah, I think maybe part of the difficulty of it was that we had a global pandemic hit the United States at a time when our politics had become more volatile than any time that I've experienced in my lifetime, right? And I grew up after the 1960s. I grew up after the peak of kind of the core of post-segregation civil rights conversations. I grew up after, there were still obviously politics. There's always politics, but I think that there was just a different way that politics embraced the nation during the Trump presidency, and the way the sorting of the contemporary Democratic and Republican parties has played out. And unfortunately, what you saw was in many cases a partisan sorting in response to COVID. But you also saw that, to your point, if you weren't aligned with the orthodoxies of that partisan sorting, you were going to find yourself out of place pretty quickly.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know what to do about that, right? I don't know. I think that in many cases, the Cooper administration handled COVID with seriousness and responsibility. But I also, to your point, I was trying to follow the threads of which parts of this were political science and which parts of this were applied public health policy. And, I think going forward, to your overall point about health, now is when we most need to recover our footing on that front. And our sort of post-COVID maybe biggest failure as a community has been our, so far, inability to successfully grapple with the opioid crisis, right? And the impact of that, as you could argue it's a companion public health scenario, but it's certainly an epidemic in its own right here. And our Metro Public Health Department really does need to publicly step into that. And as I will say, I watched Mayor Dean do a really good job with preventive public health. I remember very clearly he elevated a member of his staff to be a director of healthy living. We won a consequential federal grant to the tune of $7.5 million called Communities Putting Prevention to Work. You may remember he did the Walk 100 Miles campaign. I told the then director of health, Bill Paul, who has gone on to bigger and better things at a national and global level, at the time, that I expected that, and this was obviously not knowing that COVID was coming, but that if we looked down the road from the things that came out of the CPPW era here and Mayor Dean's focus on fitness and nutrition, right, the healthy eating, active living combination, that we may see long-term improvements in public health outcomes in Nashville. And I think that's really important to be mindful of.
Yeah.
And we need to get back to that.
Well, I mean, obesity it's just such a huge problem. And, the foods that we eat right now, I mean, with the glycosates and it's a crisis, and we don't even know it. I mean, between the fast food and, the cheeseburgers, and I mean, I go back to COVID, I hate to say this, but eat a cheeseburger, get a vaccine. I'm like, it stands for everything I'm against. Like, I can't support that, because you're telling people to eat the thing that is going to kill them too. I get it. You're enticing people in a way, but that was the messaging, instead of, hey, here's here's some fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
But I digress. So let's get into downtown, because that's, I guess, where I'm going to say you're the most controversial. There's a few issues I wanted to kind of go over with that. Sound ordinance downtown.
Yeah.
Do you support a bill that would limit music outside the downtown Nashville bars?
So the reason this is of interest to me is because Chief Drake specifically approached the administration to request some assistance. As we've watched the number of requests for service in the entertainment district go up, to the point where we now have a specific entertainment district initiative within Metro Nashville Police Department. I am very, I guess I would say I am very likely to listen seriously to a request from the Chief of Police for legislative relief in a regulatory regard. Now, that's not to say that I am likely to rush something through, but I know Councilmember Syracuse has worked with the administration, and I want to see what the response from business owners is, and I want to see what the specifics of the public safety-based request for this are, and see what we can produce.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess, the business response on Broadway is going to be no.
Sort of. I mean, early there's been, I will say it this way, it got at least workshopped with some people that didn't reject it out of hand out of the gate. And now I think it's going to be a question of who are the stakeholders, who are the ones that have responsible versus irresponsible voices in this, what are their incentives, what are the drawbacks here, and can you get, I mean, my question in almost all of these things that involve a regulatory component is, can you get to a tolerable equilibrium? And right now it still seems to me that some characteristics of the entertainment district are operating outside of the concept of a tolerable equilibrium.
Yeah. So I guess, so the chief of police is the one that proposed the sound, I guess call it.
Yeah,
sound
I don't
ordinance?
know if I don't know if MNPD's lawyers said, hey, here's what we'd like in legal language, but the chief of police did approach the mayor's office, to my understanding, and say, can you help us with some constraints on the sheer amount of noise on Broadway?
Do you know what kind of problems that's causing?
I'm not sure if it's identifying. I mean, it could be anything from if there is somebody calling for help, if there is, a report of gunfire, if it may be making it harder to isolate specific incidents related to noise. It may be about police radios. There may be a variety of things here. I've heard so far the chatter around it seems to focus on the ability to provide a timely and effective public safety response. But I'm eager to hear more details from that.
What do you think about the homeless issue downtown? I mean, there's homeless. They pee, they defecate, they they post their tents. Do you support them? Being able to put their tents out downtown, or would you? Because for instance, Portland.
Yeah.
We see what has just happened there over the last few years. Would you have a different approach?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I am downtown regularly. I have only ever been sent one picture of a tent, and it didn't last long. There are other places where across the city there are encampments, but I would say generally speaking, and I've worked on the issue of homelessness now for really on and off for 20 years, but more intensely for the 8 years I've been on Metro Council representing the area where most of the providers are located and most of the people experiencing homelessness congregate. But there are encampments all over the city. They are almost never on the streets of downtown. Now, I will say I've been, sent video of people defecating, but it's not just the homeless. It's people off of party buses. I've seen both vomiting and urination from that. I've seen people walking out of honky-tonks doing the same thing. So I wouldn't just associate the behavior with people that are assumed to be itinerant or homeless. There are a lot of unfortunate behaviors perpetrated by a lot of people downtown right now. Overall, I'm cautiously optimistic about where we are with this. Legislation that I led last year has created the first ever standalone Office of Homeless Services. I am excited for that department as a new Metro department, which to his credit, Mayor Cooper has funded in its first year. He has also led our first ever large investment in mitigation of homelessness. That's going to include, we hope, creation of permanent supportive housing for the people that are hardest to house, that are more likely to be chronically homeless, that we will have some of the temporary housing. I just met a guy this afternoon who has been homeless for 23 days. Generally speaking, the cities that are performing well, for somebody who newly becomes homeless, you want them to become rehoused within 30 days. So you do a model called rapid rehousing. We've got some funding for that, some additional supportive services, and some security funding there as well. If we deploy all of that well with a good office, we should be able to continue to focus on public health and safety measures where we've seen that kind of get a little bit out of hand at some of our encampments. We should be able to offer pathways into housing for people that are congregating in areas that are more public. And my hope is that this is a good opportunity for this new office to demonstrate the strengths of its existence.
Some of the bar owners on Lower Broadway say that they've had to hire their own police force. I think they're spending around $4 million a year from that, and they suggest that you did not support more police in that area and more enforcement. Is that true?
I'd love to
and
know
what's your
names, and I'd love to understand this because there is not a honky-tonk based police force. I'm ex officio on the board of the Nashville Downtown Partnership. I know Steve Smith personally is running ads against my mayoral campaign. If that is what Steve Smith is claiming, that's one thing. There is a Broadway Entertainment Association. They have never called me to say, hey, why don't you support more police presence? I have been a vocal supporter of the existence of the Entertainment District Initiative. And as a member of the Nashville Downtown Partnership, I think they were moving to advance the model of safe and clean that they've provided for a long time. And I think there are still a lot of things to look at from the PSO model that they've arranged, but that is not something that I understand the honky-tonks are presiding over.
Okay, so you don't, like, there's not another police force being funded by anybody else?
There's a business development fund
Okay.
that was recently imposed. The overall district merchants downtown supported the existence of this. And again, it did go into additional public safety capacity down there, but all of that is being administered by the Nashville Downtown Partnership. I am not aware of a private police force that is administered by honky-tonk owners. And if you are, please share details.
Yeah, no, that was my understanding. So but let's say it's the Nashville Downtown Partnership. What is that then? Explain that to me.
So the Nashville Downtown Partnership oversees urban Nashville's two business improvement districts. So there is the Central Business Improvement District, which covers most of downtown. There's also the Gulch Business Improvement District. They each have a corporate board of directors, but the overall umbrella organization for presiding over those two districts is the Nashville Downtown Partnership.
Okay, who funds that?
The property owners do.
Okay,
so basically, to create those districts, the boundaries are established by a majority of property owners within the district, and they pay a surcharge on their property tax that then funds the Downtown Partnership's operations.
Okay, but they're not giving private money to that? Not giving extra money to that?
Well, I mean, in the form of, like, if you go downtown, you'll frequently see people on Segways and yellow jerseys. Those are ambassadors of the Nashville Downtown Partnership. They help people find where to go. While they're not necessarily a police presence, they are an organized presence with a supportive organization downtown to try to make sure that people walking around any part of downtown are experiencing a safe environment. They have multiple vehicles that are used for cleanliness, like street sweepers. They will empty the corner trash cans after special events. It's a pretty comprehensive downtown organization, not unlike, there's a whole national network of downtown organizations, and ours is known as the Nashville Downtown Partnership.
Okay, so you're not aware of another police force that has police from outside districts that come in and...
They do have a proprietary security organization that is enabled under state law, but that is not administered by the honky tonks.
Okay, who runs that? Who funds that then?
The partnership does.
The partnership does.
Yeah.
So I guess that's what they're saying. Then I'm just trying to get to that because I'm not an expert at this. I guess they're saying that they're funding whatever it is, the partnership.
Yeah.
That funds I guess it's a private police force, or maybe it's a state-run police force that allows officers to come in from other parts of the state.
Right.
Do you support that?
I will say I think the partnership is looking at enhancing public safety downtown, and as a board member, even without being directly involved in the procurement decisions of which vendors to work with, I think the PSO model was done with the full awareness and I believe supportive of MMPD. And yeah, I mean, I will say it this way. I am supportive of whatever innovative approaches we can take to keep downtown safe for residents and visitors alike.
Okay.
And this seems to be something that the partnership is continuing to monitor, refine, and work on its effectiveness.
Okay. And you didn't support less funds for police
No.
on the lower Broadway area.
Nope.
Talking about like the Steve Smith back and forth. He ran ads against you. You tweeted, actually, I'll read it directly just to get your response for it here.
Yep.
You tweeted, if every place owned by Steve Smith closed, the city would be safer, Broadway would be less obnoxious, and the beer would be cheaper. Why did you tweet that? And it sounds, from the outside,
Yep.
like you don't want businesses to succeed on Lower Broadway because there's a lot of other bars that are a lot like Steve Smith's bar. They have live music, they have alcohol, and it sounds like an attack on Lower Broadway. And so you can imagine the people that are there, they think when you say things like that, well, that's your position to go and close down Lower Broadway, or at least slow the businesses down, or at least businesses like Tootsie's or Kid Rock's or those type of bars that you don't want them there at all. What is your position, and how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I'll tell you, another multi-venue operator downtown literally sent me an animated GIF of applause because they all know what a pain Steve Smith is as a personal operator. That's why I didn't say if every place downtown closed. Frankly, if they were under new ownership, it would probably be safer. The number of requests for service from police generated this year out of Steve Smith's establishments would almost qualify them for public nuisance treatment. It's insane.
But it's a lot of the other places too.
Not like this.
Yeah.
We have the logs.
Yeah, I would love to see the logs.
Yeah.
I mean, my experience going downtown, and I've been going downtown, my whole life. Broadway just kind of hit big, 10, 12 years ago, got really busy per se, maybe a little longer. But, they're all pretty much the same. I mean, my friends, I'd say
they are definitely not the same. As somebody who grew up going to Robert's Western World.
Well, Roberts is one. Okay, sure. Roberts is one thing. But
Legends
if you look
Corner is not the same as like Honky Tonk Central. Definitely not.
More touristy at Honky Tonk Central. But yeah, I see what you're saying with that. But
Old Red, not the same.
It can be.
I've been
pretty
in
close.
all of these places.
I have too. I've been,
Acme Feed and Seed, not the same.
So you're saying that just the ones that are like, which ones are good, which ones are bad? Then, and how would you choose that? Because when you write a tweet like that, a lot of the other mayoral candidates stayed out of that.
A lot of other mayoral candidates aren't being singled out by a single honky tonk owner either, and hundreds of thousands of dollars of television spending.
Do you think it's helped you or hurt you, or are you using that to, in your opinion, help your campaign?
Well, I mean, it remains to be seen. I'm not going to sit there and take it from a guy like Steve Smith, though. I mean, it's outrageous to me that a single business owner is getting this invested in the mayor's race.
Well, I mean, so do you think that his ads got Mayor Cooper not to run?
No.
No, you don't think that had anything to do with it?
I think it had zero to do with Mayor Cooper's decision.
Do you know why Mayor Cooper ended up not running by any chance?
I mean, I can read Mayor Cooper's public statement, and then from there, I don't know if anybody really knows.
So I guess bar owners that are not like Steve Smith, you don't have a problem with. And of course, he ran attack ads against you.
Right.
And so you're saying, I'm defending myself against attack ads. Are you going to single him out, though, if you're mayor?
I don't know. We haven't gotten to the end of the mayor's race yet. First, I have to get to be mayor.
I'm saying, if you're mayor, would you look at singling him out?
I will say this. I am not going to sit by while somebody spends hundreds of thousands of dollars attacking me personally.
But you're a politician. You're running for mayor.
Sure.
You can't use your political office for slamming a business. I mean, you might get attacked by a lot of people. Are you just going to turn on them if they attack you?
I mean, I'll just say it this way. The city makes deals with all kinds of companies and institutions. look at anything we've done over the past 30 years going back to the Titans, right? I mean, theoretically, the city could have partnered with Larry Flint to make the world's largest Hustler Hollywood store, right? We get to be strategic about not only what we invest in, who we invest in, what kinds of people we'd like to attract to this city. I'd be perfectly happy to have a Broadway full of places that were more appealing to people of all ages than walking out of the Ryman Auditorium, pulling out of the parking garage, and having a party bus blaring lyrics as I roll down my window that my daughters can hear, that are things I won't even repeat on a podcast.
Yeah, but do you think though? I mean, big picture. This is personal for you. You know, do you think that it could be dangerous using your power as mayor, and at least acknowledging using your power as mayor against someone that attacks you personally?
That's not how I intend to govern. The way I intend to govern is to look at the priorities of the city and the things that the city of Nashville. What I've heard for months is that there are people who used to come downtown that are locals that miss it, that want to come downtown more often, and they feel repelled by the atmosphere downtown right now. Mm-hmm. It's not everybody, but it is a lot of people who have spent a lot of time in this city. And ultimately, I would love for the idea of downtown to be more than just the entertainment district. I would like for the entertainment district not to repel locals. And I would like for the city as a whole to not have the chaos of the entertainment district become symbolic of the city as a whole.
I see. What would you do about the smell of downtown? Because it's getting pretty bad.
So this is where the partnership has actually been pretty important, and we have looked specifically at the time, like the sequencing and times of doing the street sweeping, getting, you know, the gutters kind of attacked from a standpoint of power washing and all of those kinds of things. I mean, there is simply a lot of foot traffic. There's a lot of stuff that spills out onto the street, whether it's from a vehicle or from an establishment that's brick and mortar. The solid waste strategy that we are pursuing for 2nd Avenue as the recovery continues, all of those things are they're in progress right now, and my hope is that eventually we get to, again, a wonderful scenario where all of the streets of downtown are as clean as they possibly can be, given the amount of traffic and the amount of things that come onto the street.
Have you ever looked into the trash trucks that don't allow leaking?
Yes, and I've had that conversation. So this is what's interesting, right? Over the past few years, we have watched our overall solid waste operations move from what was our public works department over to the Metro Water Department. That is currently under what I would characterize as a somewhat flimsy memorandum of understanding. And one of the things I hope to do very quickly in a new term is establish a permanent home for solid waste. I think once we do that, we're actually going to have leadership in that department that I am going to, yes, have another conversation with about just the simplicity of those kinds of trucks, because I have personally witnessed the stuff leaking out of the trucks we currently have operating in parts of downtown.
Yeah, and you know, with that too, you know, do you know how often the streets are swept and cleaned?
I haven't gone back and looked in the schedule in a minute, but that is something I've talked about with the partnership.
I mean, it's, you know, what we don't want is Nashville ending up like New Orleans.
That's right.
And New Orleans stinks. You know, I think that, you know, within the city, I think you got to be careful. I don't like, you know, I don't like your position on that with the, you know, somebody attacks you, you know, because you're going to be, if you win, you're going to be in a powerful position. And it does make me trust you less. I think you make a lot of great points in this conversation, but, you know, you don't want people that are afraid of you as business owners. And that, I'm not going to say consensus, but the undertone in the business community is that is their worry about you. And
I'd love for you to name names if you're going to say that, because we have incredible support from the business community.
Well, I mean, it's I'm not going to name names and get people.
Well, good. I mean, I have named names, and you can go look at my disclosures, and they're bipartisan, they're robust, and they're citywide, and they're small business owners, and they're large
I guess
business
my point is, though, if you have people are concerned about those type of things, I'm not saying that there's not good people supporting you, good business owners. I'm saying that those type of comments make people not trust you as much. And so when you do things like that, it hurts the city overall, even if somebody is attacking you. Nobody else, and I agree, nobody else was attacked. Fair enough. But when I've talked to other candidates about it, they won't say anything. They're like, I don't want to get into the dirt here. Yeah. And if you look at the comments on your Twitter, you have people that supported you are like, I wish you wouldn't have done that. And that's all I'm saying is, if you're mayor, you got to be mayor of the whole city, even people that are against you, because that's what we need to build bridges, not walls. We're in the most divisive times in the history of the country.
Story. Before we got to this point, I voluntarily and independently reached out to try to sit down with Steve Smith, and he refused that and instead started running these attack ads. If he wants to make it personal, it can certainly be personal, but that was not how I started this conversation.
Yeah, fair, but I mean, I guess it depends on where you want to go with these things.
I want to go with celebrating the idea of Nashville, of Music City, of our vibrant business community. I want to make it possible for businesses large and small. I want to make it an amazing place for entrepreneurs. Fundamentally, I want our livability as a city to be the thing that attracts visitors. And we've gotten a little bit away from that.
Yeah.
And I am not going to celebrate everything that I think Steve Smith's particular establishments represent. I'm not going to defend that. But I am not going to spend my mayoralty or the rest of this campaign attacking him. I'm also just not going to sit there and take it when he makes completely attacks that he can't defend with data when he is as much a culprit for the things he's accusing me of being. I'm not mayor right now. I don't have any.
You're running to be mayor.
I am.
And you could be. You're leading in the polls.
Correct. But right now, today,
yeah,
I don't have hire fire over the chief of police. I don't have most of the executive authority that deals with the permitting process. We have watched a lot of chaotic things happen that are not an executive function that I currently possess. He is trying to blame me specifically for that, and I definitely reserve the right to defend myself.
No, you definitely have the right to defend yourself. I mean, I think there's what did Michelle Obama say? When they go low, we go high. And I'm just throwing that out there. Sure. And I hope that if you are mayor, that those that have lost some trust with those comments, you can build those bridges, because we need this city.
If I know anybody who's lost trust, I'm happy to go back and try to rebuild those bridges. Fair enough. It is absolutely my intent to govern the city for all Nashvillians, to try to rebuild trust actually in Metro government. And most of that's going to come from the performance of Metro government. We have watched even my own neighbors who have seen the city's sharp growth within view of their porches and front steps. And they will tell me about sensing a decline in city services. Fundamentally, I want Metro to be a top-tier customer service organization, a trusted partner in conversations with the community, and a place where we can all live, work, play, and to the extent of our abilities, invest.
Yeah, no. And I want the exact same thing. And, we have some good candidates. I've interviewed a couple of them, Matt Wilshire and Alice Rowley. I'll probably interview a couple more next week. And, I think with all the things that we've talked about, the problems that we've had the last 4 years with COVID, we've got to work together on uniting. And we can have a difference of opinion on complex issues, even on personal issues. And I think we've lost, in a way, the ability to have a conversation. And I hope that if you are mayor, that you can have that conversation, and that vision you just gave is what's leading and what's making a positive difference for the city, because it's better for everybody. Nashville needs to be a better city for everybody, for the poor, for the middle class, for the rich. We need to be a city for everybody, and I think that's important.
Yeah, and I'll reemphasize the point. I offered the conversation; it was refused.
Yeah, hey.
So we'll continue with anybody who wants to be a participant.
Fair enough. In closing, you want to bring up anything maybe we didn't cover, or say anything, to the people listening?
So I think the biggest thing that has really informed my thinking about the decision to do this has been what I've heard for a year and more all around the city about the difficult choice people are making about whether or not to stay in Nashville. And sometimes it's because of some of the political strife we've had, right? The tension in state and local issues, sometimes seeming adversarial to specific communities. But as often as not, it has everything to do with the things that we have chosen either to prioritize or focus on or have a lack of focus on as a city. And I think some of that has been Metro's volatility over the past 8 years, the 5 years in particular, where we've gone through 3 mayors in 3 years. And so what I really want to establish is a collection of priorities in the mayor's office where we demonstrate our capacity to perform basic city services effectively, where we do rebuild actual trust in and confidence in our ability to invest in ourselves, and ultimately that we also don't lose sense of the aspiration of being able to do things that we know cities across, not just the South, cities across the country and cities across the world do, which is do the livability things of sidewalks and neighborhoods. You've raised the point about concerns about the quality of education, the approaches we're going to have to take to ensure safety community-wide, but also our biggest missing ingredients. And some of those are elements like a transit system and one that can respond to innovation. It's some of the long-term thinking that we need to do to make sure that we can weather economic externalities, public health externalities, severe weather, all of those things. And I think at the end of the day, yes, we have a lot of good candidates running for mayor. I don't think the majority of the candidates come to the table with the preparedness to govern on day one, understanding all of the tools that Metro specifically, our local government specifically, have to bring to bear to improve cost of living and quality of life for residents, to improve a business environment for those that are starting and operating businesses here, and ultimately to have the priorities of the city be focused on the project of making it just a little easier to stay here. So that's, at the end of the day, that's why I'm running.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming here. I know it's a long form interview. We got a lot in, and I appreciate just having an open conversation. And
it's really great. Thanks for providing the space for it.
All right, thank you. Please like and subscribe if you want to hear further conversations.